and welcome to Book Circle. I'm Earl Weinberg. This time we will continue our reading of Over the Gate by Miss Reed. We're hearing at second hand Joseph Coggs' experiences at the Beresford seaside, where he met the Old Man of the Sea. As far as I can gather, Joseph stayed with his younger twin sisters as he had been bidden to do by his mother until they had eaten their sandwiches at midday. The three children had played blissfully with the sand and the shells for which Beresford is famous, but in the afternoon Joseph began to get restless. The two little girls had started a mammoth earthworks with which they were entranced. Joseph found the business of digging remarkably boring. After all, he could dig any time in Fairacre. What Joseph wanted to do was to explore. Mr. and Mrs. Willett, propped comfortably in the shelter of a breakwater nearby, saw his predicament. "You go and have a look round, Joe," said Mr. Willett. "We'll be here for a bit reading the paper. We'll keep an eye on your sisters." Joseph scrambled eagerly to his feet, his dark eyes sparkling, and set off in the direction of the pier. "Don't forget, tea's at 4:30, bellowed Mr. Willett in the voice that carries across the mighty winds of Fairacre. "Keep your eye on your gold wristwatch." Mr. Willett gave a mighty chuckle at his own wit. Mrs. Willett smiled wanly, and the two little girls looked at him open-mouthed. "He ain't got a wristwatch," explained one. "Tch," said Mr. Willett testily, and shook out the newspaper. Joseph made his way diagonally across the sand toward the sea. His feet were bare, and he gloried in the feel of the wet ribs of sand under his instep. The tide was out, leaving pools of every imaginable shape. Here and there were outcrops of slaty black rock. These Joseph found particularly fascinating. Slimy bladder-wrack covered many of them, and he squatted happily on the rubbery mounds, popping the salty blisters one after another. There were limpets, too, gray, ribbed, and conical, that he tried in vain to prise from the rock. He was intrigued by the way he could move them a trifle, and then no more, as they put out their defenses. He wandered nearer and nearer to the pier. Here the pools were deeper, and he discovered for the first time the brown, jelly-like anemones that waved their tentacles and sucked at his finger. There were a number of people walking along the pier or hanging over the railings, gazing at the sea. Joseph recognized some of the Fairacre party among them, but he was not particularly interested in what went on aloft. It was the great substructure of crisscrossed iron girders which Joseph intended to explore. They were very cold, wet, and rusty, he discovered. Brown streaks and green slime covered their gaunt shapes, and where the water lapped the legs, green fringes swayed to and fro rhythmically. Joseph made an attempt to climb up one of the girders, but the ironwork was cruelly hard to hands and feet. Little flakes of metal came off at a touch, and the salty roughness made his fingertips sore. He abandoned the attempt and stood listening to the strange noises around him. Above his head came the thudding of people's feet as they walked the planks of the pier. Around him came the constant sound of trickling water as it ran down the girders or dripped into the rock pools. The wind made a little whistling sound in the iron latticework, and always as a bass accompaniment there was the rushing and booming of the swirling sea. It was particularly rocky under the pier. Great flat plateaus of rock overlapped, forming wide, irregular steps. At their edge were deep pools, almost black in the dim light beneath the pier. Joseph, stepping into one, caught his breath as the water came high above his knees. He scrambled out of the slippery hole and walked in a more gingerly fashion, peering at this strange and frightening element. He was now almost at the end of the pier. Above him he could hear people walking round the little theater. There was a distant sound of teacups, for a small refreshment room adjoined the theater. Sometimes a child called. Sometimes a gull wheeled and cried. It was difficult to tell which was the human voice. Joseph found it all wonderful and strange. At length he came to a large pool. It was overhung by an outcrop of rock and was as dark as ink. Something large, colored red and white, seemed to be floating in it. Cautiously, Joseph approached, knelt upon the slippery rock, and peered over. To his horror, he saw that it was the motionless body of a boy. Surely he must be dead. His eyes were closed, his legs and arms floated gently away from the body, and his hair moved as rhythmically in the water as the tentacles of the anemones had done. Fearfully, his throat aching with suppressed screams, Joseph put out a shaking finger and prodded the body. "Give over," said the corpse, opening its eyes suddenly. Joseph flinched away, startled, scraping his knee painfully on the sharp rock. There was a wild thrashing in the pool, and the red trunks and legs were submerged, and only the top half of the body confronted Joseph. "What you think you're up to?" demanded the bather, "poking at people like that?" Joseph, never very voluble, found communication more difficult than usual. For one thing, he was in a state of shock, and for another, he was extremely puzzled. The stranger was very small. He had believed him to be a boy, possibly 2 or 3 years younger than himself, but as soon as he spoke, he realized that despite his small stature, the bather was a grown man. Somehow it all seemed part of the fantastic world immediately around Joseph. Anything could happen here among the faintly menacing shapes of the girders and rocks. The cold, salty air was as far removed as it could be from the pollen-laden winds that blew around Joseph's native village. The music of birdsong and rustling trees was exchanged for the queer atonal sound of dripping water and surging sea. He felt as though he had strayed into an unknown world where colors, shapes, sounds, and now people themselves were strange and sinister. Despite his aching throat, he managed to swallow and find his voice. "I'm sorry, sir," he said tremulously. Immediately he was glad he had added that last word to his apology. The little man's face softened. A look of gratification passed over the pudgy countenance, and he wiped the wet hair away from his forehead. "That's all right, boy," he said grandly. "Now you're here, you can give me a hand out." He presented a cold, wet hand to Joseph. It was as small as those of Joseph's little sisters, but on the back were the hairs of a grown man. Joseph tugged with all his strength. There was a good deal of puffing and blowing, and then the little man bounced from the pool onto the rocks. "Get my towel, boy, will you?" asked the stranger, waving toward the direction of a nearby girder at the outside edge of the pier. Joseph saw a bundle propped between the angle of the 2 girders out of the wet, and made his way carefully across the slimy rocks to do as he was bidden. There was something imperious about the man which awed Joseph. He was glad to be of service to him. When he came to withdraw the rolled-up towel from its resting place, Joseph was surprised to see that a few yards of rope ladder were tucked in with it. One end was obviously fixed aloft, and Joseph stepped out beyond the pier to see where it went. He could see it lashed securely to the bottom stay of the pier railing. From there it hung down against the girders, flapping gently in the breeze. Joseph guessed that at its full length it would easily reach the sand. Tucked up as it was, a little higher than his head, it was unnoticeable at a cursory glance. "Come on, I'm near freezing," shouted the man. Joseph hurried back with the towel. The stranger, jumping up and down with remarkable agility, was covered with goose pimples. He snatched the towel from Joseph's arms and began to rub himself energetically. Joseph surveyed him with interest. Now that the water had drained from his hair, Joseph could see that the man was fair. He was thick-set and very muscular. His chest and legs were faintly hairy, and he had the suspicion of a mustache. His eyes were very blue, his ears very red. Joseph wondered how old he was. It seemed strange to think that he might be as old as his father, and yet he was no bigger than one of his twin sisters. The man gave his head a final rub, threw the towel round his waist, and turned to look at Joseph. "Perishing cold under here," he said. "Let's sit outside for a bit." He indicated the sand beyond the pier. A little faint sunlight was struggling through the clouds and chasing the shadows across the bay. The 2 picked their way across the rocks. At the edge of the pier the man stopped. "Anyone about?" he asked. Joseph looked up and down the beach. There were a number of people further along, but no one at hand. The most popular beach, where the Willets were already beginning to think of packing up and making their way to Bunce's, lay behind them. "Can't see anyone," said Joseph, wondering at the man's sudden desire for privacy. They emerged into the open. It was a relief to feel flat sand again underfoot. "I'll show you how to warm up after a bathe," cried the little man, whose spirits seemed to have rapidly risen. He flung off the towel and did a backward somersault before Joseph could draw breath. "Core," said Joseph, full of admiration. "Who learnt you that?" "Never you mind," answered the man. "Watch out now." He flexed his muscles, stood on his toes, took a deep breath, and then turned 3 backward somersaults in a row. After the last, he stretched his arms above his head, looking this way and that as though acknowledging applause. Joseph thought he looked just like the acrobat he had seen in the pantomime last Christmas. If anything, he was better, because he was so small and neat. Joseph was entranced. "That's chicken feed," said the man. He swaggered slightly, thrusting his thumbs into the tops of his red trunks. "Look at this." He stretched his arms again and began to turn cartwheels with extreme dexterity and rapidity. He wheeled so steadily that his red trunks and white torso seemed to blur before Joseph's admiring eyes. He must have turned almost 20 times before he ceased and became upright again. "Ain't you a marvel?" breathed Joseph, awed. The little man laughed, but was obviously pleased with the boy's admiration. He smote him cheerfully across the shoulders, and they sat down together in the shelter of a rock. Joseph compared their outstretched legs. His own were thin and brown, marked with many an ancient scar on the shins and the fresh scrape across one sore knee. The stranger's were several inches shorter than his own, but twice the thickness, and bulging with muscles. "Do you live in Beresford?" asked the stranger. "No," said Joseph. "Do you?" "Not likely, not in this one-eyed dump. Do I look as though I live here?" He cocked a blue eye upon Joseph. Anxious to please this Superman, Joseph hastened to apologize, although he himself could see nothing wrong with Beresford. Indeed, to someone whose home was in the modest confines of Fairacre, Beresford seemed a splendidly sophisticated place. "What's your name, sir?" ventured Joseph. "Ah, now that's tellin'," said the little man teasingly. He leant back against the rock, clasping his hands behind his head, and gazed quizzically at the boy with half-closed eyes. "I think you'd better call me the Old Man of the Sea," he said lazily. "That's where you found me, wasn't it?" "The Old Man of the Sea," echoed Joseph, not completely understanding. "Do you mean you live there?" The man nodded, grinning at the boy's mystification. "That's right," he said. "I live in the sea, in a palace, in fact. I'm a sort of king, you know. Got a crown and that when I'm at home." Joseph pondered this. It sounded a bit far-fetched, but why should a grown man want to lie? And the whole affair was odd. The queer, dark, under-pier world, the tiny man, the cartwheels. He wanted to know more. "Where is this palace?" he asked suspiciously. "If you're not going to believe me," said the man, suddenly looking sulky, "I shan't waste my time telling you." "Oh, but I do!" cried Joseph, aghast at upsetting this godlike creature yet again. The stranger appeared mollified. "Well, if you must know, it's way out beyond the end of the pier on the seabed." "What's it made of?" asked Joseph. "Oh, rocks and stones and that," said the man airily. There was a short silence, as though he were thinking heavily, and then he began again. "Seashells, too, of course. It's sort of decorated with shells. And we have seaweed trees in the garden. It's a pretty place. Fish swimming in and out the windows. We always keep the windows open. I like a bit of fresh seawater in the rooms myself." Joseph sat contemplating this picture of royal life beneath the waves. He found it wholly enchanting, and only a fragment of his former doubt remained. "What do you eat?" he inquired. "Fish, of course," replied the little man, opening his blue eyes very wide. "What fool questions you ask! We got nets from the garden straight through the kitchen window to the larder where we keep 'em." "I like fried fish," said Joseph warmly. This talk of food was beginning to make him hungry. "Oh, we don't fry ours," answered the man casually. "Too wet, you know. Makes it difficult to keep the stove alight." "Ah, it would," agreed Joseph. Somehow the difficulty of keeping the stove going underwater seemed to make sense of the whole slightly improbable situation. "No, we eat 'em raw," said the man. "Very nutritious, too." He suddenly gave a gigantic yawn. "Ah, well, my boy, I wish I could stay longer with you, but I'd best be getting along." "Back to the palace?" asked Joseph. He half hoped that he would be invited to accompany him. The man rose to his feet and began to shake out the sand from his towel. "Not just yet," he said, smiling. "I've got some friends to call on first." He wrapped the towel around his shoulders. A distant yelling caused the two to look round. Leaning over the pier railing, just where the rope ladder was fastened, was a small figure. To Joseph, it looked like a little girl. "Come on, Bill," she shouted. "It's 4:30. Your tea's ready." "Comin', Katie," the little man shouted back and set off toward the rope ladder with incredible speed. Joseph ran beside him. He watched him untangle the lower rungs and begin to mount aloft. The strong little arms and legs twinkled over the crisscross rope like a monkey in a ship's rigging. Halfway up, he stopped and looked down at Joseph's upturned face. "Hey, boy," he said, grinning, "you cut off to your own folk, and don't believe all you hear, son." He nipped smartly up the rest of the ladder and through the railings. Joseph watched him untie the rope, his face suddenly solemn and intent. He slung it across his toweled shoulders with never a backward glance at the boy below, and vanished toward the theater. Disconsolately, with the words of his hero echoing in his ears, Joseph obediently retraced his steps, seeking, tardily and reluctantly, his own folk, who were already ensconced amidst the solid worldliness of Bunce's restaurant. "And you know the rest, miss," said Joseph, fiddling with the brass lid of the Victorian inkstand which dominates the teacher's desk at Fairacre School. His dark eyes were downcast, crescents of thick lashes brushing his dusky cheeks. "And I 'ad my tea with you, and then we come home," he continued. "I remember," I said. I also remembered Mr. and Mrs. Willett's conversation at the tea-table, of which Joseph was obviously unaware. "A pity we have to go back so soon," Mr. Willett had said. "They say there's a good show on the end of the pier." "Someone told me there's a juggler that keeps 6 bottles moving," said Mrs. Willett, "and a dog dressed up like a nursemaid pushing a monkey in a pram." "There's 12 acts altogether," said someone further down the table. "I looked at the posters. Top of the bill is the Midgets. Acrobats they are, 6 of 'em. Call themselves the Mighty Atoms or some such. Appeared before all the crowned heads in Europe, the poster said. I bet they'd have been worth seeing." "I'm partial to midgets myself," Mr. Willett had agreed before the conversation took a different turn. I looked at the little gypsy boy before me. What was going on under that black thatch of tousled hair, I wondered? Did he really believe the yarn spun for him by the fanciful midget, or did he merely want to believe it? And what should be my reaction to Joseph's disclosures? I doubted whether this was the time to tell him the cold truth, whether, in fact, he would ever want to know the truth. It seemed wiser, I decided, to say as little as possible at this stage. Joseph's feelings were still too raw to stand rough handling. If he ever wanted to know more, I felt that he would ask me, and then I should answer him with truth. At this moment the problem was settled, or at least shelved, by the appearance in the doorway of Mrs. Pringle. In one hand she held an upturned broom, in the other a dustbin lid. She looked at first like some squat Britannia with trident and shield. "You done?" she inquired glumly. "Yes, indeed," I said. Under the present trying circumstances, Mrs. Pringle's appearance was almost welcome. I put the stack of papers on top of the ancient walnut piano, anchored them safely from cross-drafts with hymns ancient and modern, locked the drawers of my desk, and made my way out into the playground. Joseph followed me, still looking thoughtful. Outside, by the doorway, Mr. Willett was perched on a pair of rickety steps. He was drawing a bent stick across the guttering, collecting dead leaves, an old nest or two, twigs and odd slivers of slate, all of which impeded the flow of rainwater to the butt behind the school. I stopped to hail him. "Run home now, Joseph," I said to my shadow. "You shall pin your best picture on the wall tomorrow morning." His countenance became more animated, and he began to move off. Suddenly, as though remembering something, he turned again to confront us. "And there was a little man," he said earnestly. "Honest, there was." "I know," I assured him. We looked at each other for a moment. Then he smiled and set off at a brisk trot through the school gates. "What's up with young Joe, then?" inquired Mr. Willett when the child was out of earshot. "He been in trouble?" "Not trouble, exactly," I answered. "I'll tell you all about it some day. Let's say he's finding life a bit of a puzzle at the moment." Mr. Willett snorted and dropped a noisome handful of muck into the bucket at the foot of the steps. "Who don't?" he demanded. And we'll hear more from Miss Reed and Fairacre next time.